The first sound I noticed at my husband's funeral wasn't the hymn or the throat clearing of the organ, or even the grief that keeps its own metronome. It was a small, insistent buzz in the breast pocket of Daniel's navy jacket, the one I had chosen because he looked honest in it. People say the dead don't take calls. They don't say anything about their phones taking messages for them. The pastor was speaking about faithful years and steady hands, about the sort of kindness that never asked for witnesses, and I was standing there, close enough to see the threadbare edge on Daniel's cuff, when the phone shivered a second time like a moth against glass. I slipped my hand into the pocket with the practiced secrecy of a woman keeping one last thing for herself. On the screen, a message sat blunt as a stone. "I'm still here." I didn't gasp. I didn't look up for a camera crew or a priest with answers. I locked the phone and placed my palm over it the way you press down a letter before you're ready to read it. The sanctuary kept speaking. People nodded. Someone coughed. The flowers, that overwilling troop, leaned into the aisle with their heavy heads. Was 58% in the room and the rest of me was in a pocket trying not to shake. After the service, I stood by the door the way the widow is supposed to, receiving casseroles disguised as condolences, or maybe condolences disguised as casseroles. Everyone knew the words. They lined up to return them to me like library books. "Your strength inspires me." He was a good man. If you need anything, I smiled the smile grief picks out for you at the shop when you're too tired to shop for yourself. Between embraces, I pressed the side button and looked again. "I'm still here," the message insisted, as if it had rehearsed this line. I found an empty corner of the hallway where the carpet was old enough not to squeak, and I scrolled up. The thread was clean until yesterday. No jokes, no pictures, no chain of logistics about milk or batteries or who was bringing the salad. Just an earlier text I hadn't seen. "Will you be there Tuesday?" Then a draft unsent, like a thought that broke its foot before it reached the door. I want to say it out loud. The contact name was a single letter, M. Not Mara spelled out, not Maria, not Mum, not Mercy, or Morning, or anything else. Just M, the sort of initial you keep when the full name is a room you're not sure you're ready to enter. At the fellowship hall, people arranged food on long tables that have seen more life than some marriages. I kept my smile on and my questions folded. Someone pointed to the corner where Daniel once repaired a bench and said, "Didn't he fix that hinge?" Someone else said, "He always liked Tuesdays, didn't he?" I looked at the clock. It wasn't Tuesday. It was the day after everything. The message in my pocket felt like a coin I was scared to spend, and more scared to lose. I carried a plate I didn't want and found a chair near the door with a view of the parking lot. Outside, umbrellas bloomed, closed, bloomed again. Inside, a baby made a noise that sounded like a small complaint, and then remembered life and stopped complaining. I unlocked the phone and tapped the voicemail icon, because the dead are sometimes better at telling the truth when they're already on the other side of saying it. There was one new memo from 3 days ago. I put the phone to my ear like a seashell and listened for a tide. "May," Daniel said, and my name in his voice worked on me like a locksmith. If I don't manage to say this while I'm still the sort of alive that can eat soup with you, there are some words I'd rather you found in my own voice than woven through someone else's summary. I have been practicing the truth in pieces. Tuesdays, mostly. Grove Street. Back pew. If you're hearing this, I ran out of pieces before I assembled the whole. I thought I was protecting you by keeping the mess for myself. Really, I was protecting my fear. Love, as it turns out, doesn't need my protection. It needed my honesty. He paused, and I could hear the broad quiet of our kitchen. Then he said, "The letter you'll find in my coat, The one marked for after is for you. This, this is for M. If you find it first, tell her the bench still holds. Tell her the door is still light enough to open. And tell her that I am still here the way a promise is still here, after the person who made it has misplaced his courage. I sat there a moment, letting the present and the past take turns like well-behaved children. The message the phone had delivered at the sanctuary wasn't written by a ghost. It was typed by a living hand that still believed in Tuesdays. I scrolled back to the thread with M and typed, "This is May. I have Daniel's phone." The three dots rose and fell like a breath, learning to be brave, and then went away. Nothing arrived. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned the plate to the table with an apology to the potato salad I had not earned. On our way out, Reverend Lila pressed my fingers with both of hers, a light that understood switches. He loved the long work, she said, which is the only kind that stays done. If anything comes up, if anything feels heavy, come by. The hall smelled like lemon oil and the last hymn. The rain had decided to mean it. Evan walked me to the car and touched my shoulder the way he did when he was small and testing the world for sharp corners. At home, the house received us like a tired friend. I set the phone on the table, and we stood looking at it as if it were an animal we hoped would come closer on its own. "Do you want me to go through it?" Evan asked. I shook my head. I wanted to want that. Instead, I wanted to sit with the question until it told me its real name. He hugged me with the grown man arms that used to be problem arms in winter coats, and then he left me to the old ticking of our kitchen clock, which has always believed in finishing its sentences. I made tea, so I would have something to forgive for going cold. The phone stayed stubbornly quiet, which is one kind of answer. The night tugged the window down. I took the navy jacket from its hanger and laid it on the chair as if it were a person who might still change positions. In the inside pocket, under the silky fabric, I found the letter he mentioned. For after. He had neat letters, always did, like someone who believed that any word could be made kinder if you asked it to stand up straight. I didn't open the letter. I know that will disappoint some of you, perhaps even the parts of me that love a clean reveal. I put it on the table and put my hand on it, the way you do when you're blessing bread. And then I picked up the phone again and scrolled through Daniel's texts for a pattern I could live with. Work. Weather. A joke he sent to Evan about a tire that had ideas. And then the small world of Tuesdays, notes to Anna from Morning Porch about coffee filters, to Dahlia about the sign for the water cooler, to a number he never named properly, the one whose message had shaken my bones at the funeral I'm still here. I typed again. "This is May. The funeral was today. I don't know what you meant." Then I erased the last sentence because that was not true. I did know what it meant. It meant someone who had history with my husband hadn't reached the end of theirs. I tried again. "This is May. If you need to say the rest of a sentence, I can listen." The dots rose and fell and rose and fell, and then a reply arrived like a single footstep in a quiet hall. "If you're safe, go to the bench." We have several benches in our small life, but only one that ever got a plaque. Daniel had repaired it after a storm that peeled up roofs the way a bad truth peels up old paint. The brass plate says, "The next right thing, rest here." He claimed he paid for it because he liked the sentence. I suspect now that he needed the instruction I put on my coat and took an umbrella that had not earned the name and told Evan where I was going. And he said, "I'll drive behind you like a foolish parade." And we both smiled because the world was relearning how to make our mouths do that. The bench held the rain like a careful plate. I sat anyway, because sometimes your body knows where your heart would like to sit before your mind approves. The streetlight made a cone of gold we could all pretend to stand in. People passed by wrapped in their separate weather. Under the seat, taped as neatly as anything Daniel ever labeled, a small envelope waited. The tape was dry, recent. My hands were not. Inside, a single line in blue ink. Ask Anna at morning porch about Tuesdays. If you have never followed a note to a cafe, I recommend it. It's a pilgrimage that smells like cinnamon and the parts of the day that want you to forgive them. Morning porch was closing when I arrived, the bell over the door scolding me, and then deciding to let me in anyway. Anna was wiping a chalkboard that refuses to erase its convictions. She turned and saw me, and put the towel down the way a person does, when the thing in front of them just became more important than the thing they were finishing. He liked his coffee burnt, she said, without waiting for me to invent an opening move. He said it tasted like perseverance. He came on Tuesdays with a list he never showed me, and a smile that apologized for the weather when it was the weather's fault. We have a calendar, if you want to see it, with blue dots for the days, he said. Not today, but soon. On the wall, above a shelf of mugs, a little too sincere to be trusted, a small calendar wore a dozen blue stickers. Tuesdays, lonely as islands, and then not lonely once you called them by name. What did he do on those days? I asked. First we practiced not asking that, she said, and then we learned to ask it softly. He bought a muffin and left with the change turned into bus tickets. He carried socks like they were made of wool and hope. He walked to the church and sat in the back and handed water in paper cups to people who had run out of weather permissions. He wrote down names until names behaved like doors. I stood there with the sense that someone had been telling me the truth in a language I only now had enough verbs to understand. The phone buzzed in my coat pocket again, 2 small knocks from a familiar stranger. I'm still here, the screen said, and then an address and a time. Tonight, 1 block over from where the buses begin their evening prayers. Bring no one, it added, which made me bring my son. We parked 1 block away the way you do when you're practicing courage, but still want to keep your car surprised. Evan waited at the corner with a look that did not quite know how to be both protective and patient, and managed to be both anyway. I walked to the address. A storefront gone to sleep, a bench not ours, a narrow alley humming an old city song. The hat arrived before the person did, a soft brim with an attitude of staying low. The woman beneath it did not look at me the first time, because you don't look at the past right in the eyes when you're not sure if it's going to greet you or bite. She put a paper bag on the bench and kept her hand on it, like you do when you're giving up something without advertising it. I said thank you because my mother raised me to thank the bag as much as the person. If the person needed time to be a person again. She nodded at the streetlight like it was in charge. He counted cups, she said, and the voice had gravel and a small river in it. He counted like he could convince thirst to quit its job. I said, he did that with screws and hinges too, and she made a sound that had humour standing near it, and then walking away before it could be recognized. When I looked down, she was gone. The bench holding the shape of the bag, the way memory holds a body. Inside, 2 motel vouchers, 3 bus tickets, a small loaf of cornbread from the station bakery wrapped in paper that had already forgiven the day. No note, except a line in blue ink on the bag itself. Listen before asking. I took it literally because I like passing tests that have only one correct answer. Evan walked me back to the car like a man who knows that some roads can be driven and some have to be walked until the shoes learn your feet. Back at home, the phone sat on the table and did not audition for the part of miracle. I put the bag beside it and the letter under the lamp, and I told the camera in the nursery, the one we never took down after our granddaughter outgrew the crib, that I was going to talk now if it didn't mind. Cameras don't mind. They are made for holding the parts of the truth that need to sit down first. I told it about the funeral and the message and the bench and the woman with the hat, about the way Daniel had left me a breadcrumb line through a city he had not wanted to be praised for loving. I didn't open the letter that night either. Instead, I opened a drawer we call the junk drawer, but which is actually the useful drawer, the one that holds batteries and safety pins and the odd coupon you will never use and the note you're glad you kept. In the very back, behind a pack of birthday candles that believe in one more round, I found a cassette tape labeled in Daniel's steady print, for after nursery chair. He had a way of naming things that made you both laugh and do what he asked. I don't own a cassette player anymore, but the church does, and so does anyone who hasn't decided to win the future by losing the past. I put it beside the letter and turned off the lamp and let the dark teach me how to blink. The morning came smelling like coffee and something that ought to have been a second chance. I walked to the church because cars make a short journey shorter, but not always better. The door was open because Reverend Lila believes in air and welcome. She saw my face and set a hand on the table like she was ready to steady it. If the table did not feel equal to its job. "I need a cassette player," I said, and she smiled the smile that translates anything. We went to a closet that holds both mops and miracles, and found a machine that had already forgiven us for forgetting it. In the nursery, the rocker waited like a friend who never learned how to be offended. I put the tape in with the respect you give to something that contains both a voice and its bravery. The sound that emerged was my husband's, and also not, thinner and more honest because the machine could not fancy it up. "May," he said, and then he tried 3 beginnings and kept 2 of them and let the third rest. "There are days I have not known how to tell you that I was still learning how to be a person in a house where love was bigger than my courage. I made a schedule for my honesty, like a child makes a fort. Tuesdays. I repaired what I could with hinges and coffee and cups of water because the apology I owed was to people I didn't know how to reach directly, and to one person I did." He said Mara's name once, gently, like he was setting down something that breaks without warning. "If she finds you before I do," he said, "tell her I'm still here the only way I know how, in the line at the cafe, in the back pew, on the bench with the brass words that helped me before I helped anyone. Tell her I am sorry for making my fear your chore. Tell her the next right thing is small enough to carry and big enough to change the day." I stopped the tape, because sometimes you stop a good thing to make it last. Through the window I could see the bench with its useful theology. A woman in a soft brim hat leaned there, as if she had just remembered how to lean. I did not go out. The instruction on the bag had been to listen before asking, and I have lived long enough to know when an instruction would like to be followed more than admired. I sat in the rocker and let the tape roll again, and Daniel told the room how he wanted to speak to me in person, but was practicing with a microphone that looked like patience. By the time the tape clicked itself quiet, I had a plan simple enough to survive contact with the world. I would text M, the only sentence I could guarantee I meant, "You can sit in the back row if you need." I would ask Anna for the calendar with the blue dots and copy it to my own. I would carry socks and water because love does not mind being carried. I would leave the letter on the table one more night because I understood now that after is not a door you open once. It is a hallway with lights. You turn on one at a time, I sent the text. I lifted the window to let the room trade air with the day. I walked to the bench and put my palm on the cool brass words, and then on the wooden slat that held more afternoons than I could count. I did not pray, not out loud. I said thank you to the wood and the metal and the sentence and the man who had needed a sentence to stand up straight. I said it the way you say it to a person who isn't in the habit of taking bows. Then I went home to make a list, because lists are a kind of map for people who have decided not to be lost. My list was short and kind. Tea bags, paper cups, socks labelled by size, a pen that behaves, learn 3 names, don't ask the 4th until it offers to be known. Check the church door at 9:55. Sit in the back and count the cups if counting helps, but don't tell anyone the number, unless numbers are what they asked for. When the phone buzzes, answer like a neighbour, not like a detective. When the letter is ready to be opened, your hands will know before your mind consents. Trust your hands. They have done the heavy lifting for years. The phone buzzed once while I was writing, a small punctuation. I'm still here, the new message said, and for the first time since the funeral, I realized the sentence might not be about a ghost at all. It might be about a promise that outlasted its maker, about the way daylight remains as after a lamp is turned off. It might be the line Daniel hoped I would carry without making it my leash. I typed back, "We're still here," and looked out the window where the bench waited for evening, and the church collected the day the way you collect letters into a word that finally says what you meant. I told Anna I would bring napkins that actually separate without tearing, and she laughed like a person who has lost patience with cheap paper and found it again. I told Reverend Lila I would sit in the back and not take notes unless a name asked to be remembered. I told Evan he could stand where he liked so long as he didn't try to guard me from something I had already chosen. He nodded and said he would try the kind of protection that looks like nearby, not like in front. By late afternoon, the church had its evening face on. The hallway smelled like lemon oil and coffee at the same time, which is my favorite kind of ecumenical. Chairs went out in a circle that was not perfectly round because real circles in real life never are. The mercy table learned a new arrangement: cups to the left, kettle to the right, socks sorted by size with a neatness Daniel would have teased me for and secretly admired. Dahlia taped a little card near the water cooler that said, in her firm letters, "This room does not argue." She added a smiley after the period, which softened the order into an invitation. People arrived in the shape of the day they had survived. Some wore work on their sleeves. Some wore worry like a scarf they hadn't figured out how to untie. A man I recognized from the bus stop stood at the threshold and let the room decide if it meant him. I nodded once. He stepped in as if he had been waiting for permission from the air. Lila did what she always does. She didn't start so much as she let the room notice it had begun. "There's no microphone," she said. "You already have the instrument you need, no cross-exam, no shoulds. Tell a sentence you meant to say, or a sentence you weren't ready to hear when it came. If you don't want to talk, the chairs will keep you." The first voice came from a woman with paint on her jeans. She said she fixed the porch rail her father always leaned on, and then the father died, and now the rail carries ghosts and groceries with equal success. She didn't know where to put that. We put it on the table with the cups, and nobody tried to label it more precisely than true. A teenager with a tired backpack said he lied about practice and took the bus to a friend who needed him. He wasn't sorry for going. He was sorry for skipping the part where you tell the person who loves you that love is now needed elsewhere. He said he would practice that next time. I believed him, because he said it as if he had just discovered the door and wanted to learn the knob. I waited until the room had found its temperature. Then I told the smallest truth I could carry, without turning the whole evening into a play about me. "At the funeral," I said. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It wasn't a mistake. It was a person who thought they had run out of time, discovering they hadn't. It said, "I'm still here." I do not know everything that sentence means yet, but I know it means I am not alone in the part that comes after. I let the sentence sit on the chair between us. It looked comfortable, which is something I did not expect. During tea, Anna pressed a mug into my hand with the way she sets bandages, a touch that assumes healing is a thing that happens in the presence of patience. "You did fine," she said. "You didn't tell the whole story. You didn't swallow it either." I told her about the cassette and the calendar with the blue dots and the envelope under the bench and the bag with cornbread and the instruction to listen first. She nodded like a woman who had done all those steps in a different order and come to a similar door. When we pushed the chairs back and the room decided to be a hallway again, I saw it, near the door, where an early exit is closest, a soft brim hat angled in a way that made it part shadow, part shelter. The person under it stood still long enough for me to know that staying was the accomplishment I did not walk over. I filled the kettle and made a show of finding lids. I let presence be the only language we needed that night. At home, the jacket stayed on the chair as if chairs love assignments and hate vacation. I put the letter beside it the way you set siblings close when they are not yet ready to touch. The phone did not offer a miracle or a demand. I slept with the kind of sleep you get when a city agrees to carry part of your weight. The next day said a case for being ordinary. I honored it by doing ordinary things the way you do them when they are holy. I folded towels, I labeled socks. I put a pen in my bag that writes even on receipt paper. At noon, I walked to morning porch because I had promised Anna I would help close. She showed me how to clean the espresso machine, like a person apologizing to a complicated friend. When we finished, she wiped the chalkboard until only the ghosts of words remained, which is honestly how most of my thoughts look if you put them on a wall. "You want to see something?" she said. She took a small binder from under the counter. Inside, sleeves held photocopies of notes people had left over the years, small sentences paid forward like bus fare. None of them were signed clearly, and most were not addressed to a person who could answer. "I think of this as the drawer of sentences we forgot to send and then remembered," she said. I turned the pages and saw a map of a town where apologies and instructions get along. I left the door unlocked by mistake, but the wind minded it for me. "I am sober today, and tomorrow is none of my business yet. If you sit in the back row, I'll sit near the door so we can practice staying." Near the middle, a blue ink note in a hand I was beginning to recognize. Room big enough. The way the loop on the G drew back before committing itself made me forgive 17 things of beings. I didn't know I had held against anyone. I pointed to it. Anna nodded. "She drops those every few months," she said. "Always after closing. You can tell by the way the dust hasn't settled." Evening decided to be dramatic with its clouds, and then thought better of it. I walked to the church to check on the rocker, because my heart likes proof that certain objects have not learned the trick of leaving. The nursery smelled like clean wood and complicated plans. On the shelf, the cassette player waited, prim and rectangular, as if boxes are proud of their edges. I put the tape in again and let Daniel try his beginnings. He talked about learning to count names without pretending numbers were the point. He talked about the way guilt masquerades as caution. He said my name in the gentle way, May, like a month that forgives you for planting. Late. I stopped the tape, not because I had had enough, but because you can ruin a good thunderstorm by staying outside too long and pretending weather is your job. Outside, the bench received a small conversation. A man sat and folded a voucher in quarters, and then unfolded it and put it in his pocket, like he had just put a bird back to bed. A woman tied her shoe and stood slowly with the kind of care you give yourself when you've recently decided to live. None of them needed me. It is a specific relief to be unnecessary in a place you love. Back home, I put a page on the fridge. Tuesdays, learn 2 names. Don't fix anything until asked. Replace the bandages in the tote. Ask Dahlia if we can put a little lamp on the mercy table for the hour when rooms forget how to be warm. Beside the list, I taped a small photo of the bench that Evan had taken with his stubborn artist's phone. The brass line gleamed like it enjoyed its job. The following Tuesday began with weather that didn't believe in moderation. The air had weight. The sun treated sidewalks like a dare. We added a fan near the door and a sign that promised cool here without checking IDs for proof of suffering. At 5, a man in a faded cap asked if he could have 2 waters. I said yes and handed him a third to pour over his neck, because sometimes your skin has to drink before your throat does. He said, "I hate needing," which is a sentence I think belongs in a national anthem somewhere. I told him we could rename it sharing if that helped. It helped enough to finish the cup. A boy arrived with a cabinet door under his arm like a shield. He asked if anyone knew about hinges that complain when nobody is doing anything to them. Evan put a tiny bottle of oil on the table like an altar. "You're the foreman tonight," he told the boy. "Teach me what you find while you find it." The boy smiled the smile of a person who has just been put in charge of something that will not hurt anyone. Together they turned the screws slow. The metal changed its mind about squeaking. The room applauded softly, because we like when things learn polite. At dusk, the door lifted a breeze into the hall. The hat stood in the back like an idea still drafting itself. Lila straightened the stack of cups on the table and talked to me without looking like a person avoids making scared animals run. "Do you want me to speak to her?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "Let the room do the introduction." Lila nodded and allowed the night to keep its secrets a little longer. I do not know how she learned to shepherd air, but she does it better than anyone I've met. Later, when we wheeled the cart back to the closet and the hallway decided to be itself again, I found an envelope on the mercy table in blue ink. For after inside, 2 motel vouchers and a 10, just enough to be needed and not enough to be dramatic. There is a generosity I have grown to distrust, the kind that needs a trumpet. This was not that. This was the exact right weight of help. I put the vouchers in the drawer that Lila calls the lighthouse, and I call the drawer that keeps people from having to explain their night to a stranger. I walked home under a sky that had finally forgiven the day for being hot. On my porch, a neighbor sat on my top step with her shoes in her hands and her hope taking up more space than usual. She asked if she could talk without me solving. I said yes, and did the thing the card near our water cooler promises: this porch does not argue. She told me about a doctor who learned her body in a hurry, and about a boss who did not learn his sentences before he put them in her direction. She told me she wanted to quit 3 things and keep one, and did not know which was which. I held space the way you hold a ceramic bowl in a kitchen with tile floors. We did not drop anything. She left with her shoes on and her hope neatly folded. I sat a while and practiced not narrating my life to myself, which is harder than it sounds. The week spun the way weeks do, with errands and small catastrophes, and the mail giving us permission to recycle most of it. On Friday, a letter from the city arrived thanking us for sending our binder in advance of the walkthrough. It had a tone I would describe as polite confusion that we had done the tidy before being asked. I wrote in the margin with a pencil, "Daniel would be insufferably pleased." And then I erased it, because I had decided to get in the habit of not making jokes that the dead cannot defend themselves against. Saturday brought the festival of small things without anyone calling it that out loud. People appeared with items that needed witnesses more than expertise. A radio that would like to tune in to the weather again. A stool that had given up on being sturdy and then reconsidered. A story that wanted the air to hear it before the person it was about did. We circulated like a gentle weather system, moving pressure around until everyone could breathe. At noon, the station bakery wrapped cornbread for us as if paper is a kind of hug. The bell above the door still sounded like an apology and then a welcome. The woman with the silvering hair slid a small note across the counter with my change. "I hear your Tuesdays." I folded it and added it to the drawer at morning porch, where lost sentences find each other. When I looked up, the hat was across the street, angled toward the bus stop. It did not move when I noticed it. I didn't wave. I stood there, and let us both be the kind of person who can be seen without having to perform. That evening, I set the camera in the nursery to record me writing a list on the small whiteboard we keep near the rocker. It felt foolish at first. Then it felt like a conversation with a friend who has learned to be quiet. "If I forget," I wrote, "remind me that I am not an audition and neither is anyone I love. Remind me to let my son help in ways that let him remain a son, not a bouncer at the door of fate. Remind me that cornbread is sometimes what mercy tastes like because words got tired. Remind me that apologies do not change the past. They change the corridor we use to walk out of it. On Sunday, I sat in the back row because every church needs a person who is there on purpose, in the place where people go, when they are not sure they can be seen. Leela spoke about ordinary time. The church's way of saying the miracle is that you got out of bed and decided not to be unkind. Afterward, while the coffee learned to be honest, a man told me he had taken a fan home the night of the storm and returned it with a ribbon, and didn't know why the ribbon made him more embarrassed than stealing had. I told him ribbons can be bossy, and to forgive himself for wanting to make the apology look as good as it felt. Monday taught me that the thing you plan for is never the thing that arrives. The phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and a sentence that sounded like the edge of something sharp, trying to be round. "Can we meet where the streetlight flickers? No name, no time." I replied with a question mark, because brevity can be a boundary. The answer came, "Tonight." Same bench, bring no one, which is not a rule I obey around alleys. I told Evan. He said he would be across the street pretending to read the kind of magazine sold at the grocery store that is mostly pictures of houses nobody lives in. At the bench, the streetlight participated in the drama by flickering without ever actually turning off. The hat arrived with the person beneath it in a different posture, less angle, more gravity. She sat without making the bench negotiate. I sat at the other end and let the distance be named without being announced. She spoke first. "I sent the message," she said. "At the church. I was in the last row and I saw you see it." I nodded. "I thought," she continued, "that if I sent it then, you would know I meant now." She took something from her pocket and placed it on the bench between us. It was a key on a plain ring, the kind hardware stores cut for people who think the world is a door. "To the locker at the station," she said. "I have not yet decided whether I am ready to be a person who arrives with both hands open, but I am ready to return things that belong in other hands." I asked if the things were dangerous, which is the kind of question you learn to ask without making it sound like you think people are bombs. "No," she said. "Just the kind that become heavy if you keep them for the wrong season." I opened my mouth to speak, and then remembered the bag's instruction days earlier. and shut it again, eh? I let quiet be the chair we both needed. After a minute, she stood. "Do not follow," she said, and I said, "I am tired and not very fast." She smiled with her mouth, and then with something behind her eyes, and left with the kind of departure that smelled like rain that never got around to falling. The locker held 2 notebooks, a photograph, and a small envelope, with the indescribable weight of cash that would bore anyone but a crisis. The photograph was of the bench before the plaque, a younger Daniel with a younger worry folding itself into a shape he could carry. The notebooks were in 2 hands, Daniel's neat one and a spikier blue ink script that belonged to the letter lever. They were not diaries, not exactly. They were weather reports. Tuesdays, cups handed, names learned, hinges oiled, how often regret tried to trick the day into stopping. I read a page and closed the book because I have lived long enough to know when a page wants to be read slowly over bread. I left the cash at the church in an envelope labelled for the next right thing and wrote the amount privately for the binder, because Lila enjoys when numbers refrain from improvisation. I kept the photograph and copied the page with a line I needed. Try being available instead of impressive. If you need to be impressive, tighten a hinge. If you need to be available, bring a chair. When I sat on my porch that night, Evan brought a glass of water and placed it beside me, the way a son sometimes says "I love you" without making his mother perform, receiving it. "How much more do you want to know?" he asked. "Enough to carry it without it carrying me," I said. He looked out at the street like a boy looking into the ocean and trying to name each wave. "That sounds like the right amount," he said. "I'm not sure how to measure it." "We don't," I said. "We try, and if we start to drown, we call the room." The next listening night, the hat sat closer to the circle. Not in it, not yet, but within the event horizon of safety. A young man stood and confessed to returning batteries he had stolen and paying for 2 he hadn't. He said he felt stupid and also taller, which is exactly how decent choices often behave. A woman said she called her sister after 20 years and told her she had kept a postcard all this time and was ready to stop reading it like a warning and start reading it like a map. Lila let the room breathe between each sentence. We are not a clinic. We are not a chorus. We are the space where a throat takes its time. Afterward, I found a small square of paper on the chair by the door in blue ink. You don't have to forgive the past to set down what you were carrying from it. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say, forgiveness is the light in the hallway. But I knew what the sentence meant. It meant you can put the box down so you can open the door. The light is easier to aim when your hands are empty. I put the note in the drawer and didn't label it because some advice wanders better without tags. One evening, the church lost power again because old buildings like to remind you they were here before your plans. The emergency lights blew a red down the hallway. We found 3 battery lanterns and learned which corners of the room don't need electricity to know what to do. The kettle was out of work, so Anna poured cold water with the ceremony we usually reserve for heat. It tasted like rain. Everyone stayed calmer than any of us would have predicted for a group built from various degrees of panic. Later, when the power returned, a cheer rose without supervision. Even the fluorescent lights looked like they had been given a second chance to do something without flickering. A week later, the city inspector returned with an expression I recognized from people in pews. They want to say something that sounds official, but their heart has already chosen. He reviewed the aisles and the exit signs and the binder that Evan had supplemented with little tabs that said simple things like socks and water, and when he asked a question about storage. Dahlia said supplies sleep by 10, and he smiled like a man who did not expect the phrase to delight him, and it did. He signed the paper and said, Keep doing what you are doing, just keep it legible, which is not a blessing I expected to receive from an office. We celebrated with a festival that nobody named. Luis taught a stranger the hinge trick without being asked, which is the kind of graduation you can't plan a cake for. The hat sat 3 chairs from the circle and tilted, which may not sound like progress unless you have lived in a body that has needed to watch a room before joining it. Anna put out slices of cornbread that tasted like someone remembered your name, without making it a speech. Evan returned the cassette player to the closet and labelled the shelf recordings, which made me want to cry, and didn't. That night I put the letter on the table again, and I thought, perhaps this is the moment where the movie would cue a score, and my hands would tear the envelope, and a revelation would rearrange my furniture. I did not open it. I made tea and sat with the thought that has become my favourite. After is not a door you kick. It is a corridor you light. I am lighting it with cups and chairs and small sentences. The letter can be a lamp later. For now, the hall is bright enough to walk. I texted M a picture of the bench at dusk, when it looks like the world meant it. I wrote, we put out chairs again tonight. No reply came, which was the correct number of replies for an evening where the room had spoken enough. I locked the phone and put it face down on the table and stood at the window long enough for the street to become a friend again. Somewhere a bus made the sound of a tired animal that still believes in its job. Somewhere a kettle closed its mouth after a long hiss. Somewhere a hat hung on a peg, and a woman decided whether she would keep being here tomorrow. I washed the cups and stacked them small to large so they wouldn't judge one another. I turned off the kettle and the porch light and left the rocker facing the door like a chair that knows which direction hope prefers. I went to bed with a city in my ribs. I slept like a person who has promised to get up and be available well, rather than impressive. In the morning, the phone held a message sent at an hour I reserve for owls and worry thank you for not making a parade out of me, it said. The bench worked. I answered only with the photograph of the plaque and the words you made it here, which is less a sentence than a ceremony. I brewed coffee and let it get too strong on purpose. I pressed record on the nursery camera and read my small list to the room. If I forget, remind me that strength is the quiet shape of showing up. If I forget, remind me that listening without answering is a way of answering. If I forget, remind me to keep the door light enough to open from either side. Then I turned off the red light and walked into the day I had been given. I spent the next morning doing small things with ceremonial care, because that is how you prepare for big things you cannot schedule. I wiped the counter as if the wood had earned gentleness. I folded the dish towel so the edge met the edge, and nothing fought to be first. I wrote a note for myself on the fridge. Ordinary is where courage works. Then I took the navy jacket from the chair and laid it flat, and I put the sealed letter on top, and I breathed until my breath remembered me. I did not open it yet. I wanted no audience except the piece of me that had learned how to stand still. I made a bowl of oatmeal and forgot to eat it until it became a metaphor for patience. When the light in the kitchen reached the corner where it only goes after 11, I sat, slid a butter knife under the envelope flap, and let the paper decide to give way. The first line was not a trumpet. It was a doorstop. If you are reading this, I ran out of tomorrows to be brave in person. Forgive the lateness, not the love. He wrote in the way he used to speak when the subject was delicate, as if words were porcelain that still deserved to be used every day. I have been practicing telling the truth on Tuesdays, he said, because the truth frightens me less when it keeps an appointment. I should have invited you to those appointments. But I was ashamed of how long I had taken to make one. I kept thinking courage would arrive in a parade. It showed up as a chair and a cup of water. You deserved it sooner. He told me things I already knew and needed to hear in his handwriting anyway. He told me Mara had taught him the shape of loyalty when they were small, and grief had taught him the shape of retreat when they were older, and he had spent years trying to braid the two into something that could hold. He wrote about the bench and the plaque, and how he paid for the brass, because sometimes a sentence is a ladder. He wrote that he had met a woman who wore a soft brim hat and spoke like a person who had sharpened her own sentences to cut ropes, not skin. He called her by her initial, and then, halfway down the page, he called her by her name, Mara. I stopped reading there because breath is a limited resource, and I didn't want to spend it all at once. When I began again, he was already in the middle of an apology to both of us. I failed you by practicing in the next room when I should have invited you to rehearse with me. I failed her by treating my shame like something that made me noble. I am trying to fail better. I am trying to do the next right thing, while there is still a next. There was a second page folded behind the first. On it, a list that felt like the quiet version of a will. Socks, sizes labelled, bus vouchers, keep some in the book with the magnolia pressed between pages. Water, 2 cups at once on heat days. Names, 3 at a time, and learn to say them like you set down a fragile thing. There was one line circled twice. If you meet her, do not greet her with the history, greet her with a chair. I folded the letter along the crease he had made, the way you follow a path someone else already proved was passable. I set it under the magnet shaped like a pear, because the fruit has always made me think about sweetness that arrives in its own time. Then I walked to the church, because my feet wanted to be where chairs shared their work. Reverend Lila was rolling a cart toward the hall, a queen with her crown disguised as practical shoes. She saw my face and didn't ask which part of the day had done it. She simply pivoted the cart and let me take the side with the squeaky wheel so we could resent the sound together. I handed her the letter and asked if she would read it later, not to judge it, but to witness that it existed. She slid it into the pocket of her cardigan, the way people tuck hope into a coat during an in-between season. You don't have to share it to make it true, she said, but you can if sharing makes breathing easier. We set the mercy table as if we were preparing to host an argument and had decided instead to host a meal. Anna arrived with a plate of cookies that tried to be irregular and failed. They were perfect, and she looked aggravated about it. Dahlia checked the batteries in the lanterns and declared them capable of surviving a dramatic evening. If the electricity needed attention again. Evan taped a small card under the edge of the table. You are allowed to be tired. You are not allowed to be cruel. The card wasn't for the guests. It was for us. By late afternoon, the room smelled like lemon oil and coffee, which is the scent of a community that refuses to choose between clean and awake. People came with their Tuesdays folded into their pockets. A woman with a new scar held the handle of her tote, the way you hold a stranger's hand when they are trying not to cry. A boy with violin calluses pretended his fingers were fine. A man in a sun-bleached cap asked where the fan had gone, and then remembered he'd borrowed it once and flushed with a hurry of shame he didn't deserve. We told him the fan was wherever fans go to feel useful, and it would be back by 9. I looked toward the door and saw the hat, not in the back row this time, but along the wall where you can rest without the room listening. Just yet I felt the tug of the letter's instruction. I poured 2 cups of water, not because we were hot, but because we are human. I set one on the chair, 2 away from hers, and one on the chair beside my own, and sat where I could be seen without being cornering. The first voice in the circle belonged to the man with the cap. He said he had apologized to his sister for becoming a parade about the wrong things, and she had told him she preferred a bench, and they had both laughed and hung up kinder than they had begun. A woman told us she had bought back the heirloom she sold during a hard year and discovered it was heavy with a story she didn't want to carry anymore. So she gave it to a stranger who had a different, sturdier kind of back. A teen confessed to returning a set of screwdrivers and then felt silly and taller in equal measure. The room held each sentence the way a good hand holds a glass, firmly enough not to drop it, gently enough not to break it. When the chairs shifted to tea and side talk, the hat moved like a tide coming close enough to wet your shoes. I looked over without expectation. She touched the brim, as if greeting not me, but the space between us. I liked the sentence about fans feeling useful, she said. Machines deserve dignity. I said it was Dahlia's line, and that I intended to pretend it had been mine for years. She didn't smile, but some part of her face remembered how. She looked at the water on the chair, and then the other cup by me, and chose the one near me. We sat like that until sitting became its own accomplishment. Then she said, I opened the locker because you did not chase me to it. The notebooks are not confessions. They are weather. If you read them like forecasts, not history. I said I could do that. She took a breath and released it in sections, the way you do when your lungs have lived on the edge too long. He told me to text that sentence at the funeral. You know he made a plan, just in case he couldn't be the one to say it in the room. He believed phones could be lanterns if you know where to put them down. I told her he had left me a letter, and a list, and a corridor, with lights spaced closely enough that I wasn't walking in the dark anymore. Good, she said. Corridors are honest. Doors are bullies. We did not talk about sisters or brothers, or who had done what and when. We talked about benches and kettles, and which grocery store sells socks that don't go on strike after 2 washes. When she stood to leave, she placed a rectangle on the chair, a photograph of Daniel holding a hinge. His hair was making a case for its own agenda. He looked like a man who had been taught to stand up straight by a sentence, not a spotlight. On the back, in blue ink, he learned to count what stayed. It helped. The city inspector returned unannounced one evening, which is the city's way of saying we want to be sure you are generous when you think we are not watching. We were generous, but what he noticed was the binder. He flipped to the page where Evan had taped receipts in a tidy grid and wrote in the margin with a tiny smile, exemplary. He did not think we saw him write it. The next day an email arrived that lifted the weight of provisional from our permission and replaced it with through the year. I printed the email and taped it inside the supply closet at eye level for the mops. I decided it was time for the bench to have a second sentence. The first had done its job. People had learned to rest and choose one next right thing without auditioning for a prize. But some days you need the reassurance of arrival, not just the instruction for movement. Evan and I ordered a narrow strip of brass, and he engraved it in a shop that smells like heat and patience. We came at dusk with a screwdriver and reverence. He knelt. I held the plaque as if it could bruise. When he was done, the bench read what I had been saying to every person who made it to that stretch of wood. The next right thing. Rest here, you made it here. We didn't announce it. We let the evening do the work of telling. People read it and straightened their backs a little without realizing they were obeying a new verb. On a Saturday that felt like the city had decided to be a friend, Morning Porch hosted a small celebration we refused to call a celebration repair, and tea set up in the corner. A man brought a transistor radio that had not found a station since his wife left. Evan turned the dial with the tenderness of a person braiding hair, and the weather spoke Luis, taught 3 kids the hinge trick, and said, "Screws are shy at first," and nobody corrected him because it was the right way to say it. A woman with paint on her jeans sang under her breath until it was above her breath and then into the room. When she finished, everyone clapped softly, the way you clap for a pet that has learned a trick you didn't train it to do. In the late afternoon, with the light deciding to be kind on purpose, the hat walked in without the hat. The woman beneath it had hair you could trust and eyes that knew too many exits and had chosen to use the door anyway. She stood near the counter and looked at me, and then at the sign that said, "Listening in chalk," that refused to obey erasers. "I'm not ready for history," she said. "I'm ready for now." "Now we can do," I said. I poured water. I set it on the table. I did not offer a chair. I let her take one. We talked about where to buy bus tickets without having to have a conversation you didn't have the energy for. We talked about the bakery and its cornbread, and how the bell on the door always sounds like it is apologizing for something it didn't do. We talked about a thrift store, back room, with a chair that leans, and how to wedge it so it can still be a chair without making it a hazard. When she left, she tapped the counter twice, like you do when a space has done its job. That night, alone with the camera's red light and the rocker's honesty, I recorded what I had learned, because keeping it in my throat felt like hoarding. If I forget, remind me that forgiveness is not required for kindness to begin. Remind me that safety can be a porch light and a sentence, and a person who knows how not to stare. Remind me that I am still here is not a dare to bring the dead back. It is a way for the living to take turns carrying the light. The last message from the number labelled M arrived on a Sunday morning while the sanctuary was still warming up its cords. The text was short. I found a room that doesn't argue. Keep a chair for me on weeks when the sky is heavy. I replied with the only sentence I had learned to trust without rehearsing. You made it here. Weeks layered themselves into something soft enough to sleep on. The bench earned scuffs that looked like work. The mercy table developed the confidence of a thing that knew where it belonged. The kettle sighed and hissed and rested and began again. I learned the names of people I won't tell you because they belong to them and to the chairs that kept them when their feet were not yet ready. One evening, long after the year's first frost had made the grass brittle and precise, I walked the long way home, past the station, past the bakery, past the alley where streetlights flicker when they remember. I thought about the first buzz in the jacket pocket and the way a sentence can survive its speaker if the room repeats it kindly. I thought about Daniel's list and the letter and the notebooks that were weather and the photograph of a man with a hinge, counting what stayed. At my porch I sat and listened to the dark do its job. Evan brought me water. He didn't ask whether the day had been easy. He knows days are made of parts. We sat like that, 2 chairs and a cup, and I realized I'm still here had become less of a haunting and more of a hospitality. It meant there would be another Tuesday. It meant the kettle, the cards, the socks, the sentences, the lights in the corridor. It meant the bench would keep receiving knees and secrets and small victories, and the plaque would keep telling the truth. You made it here. Before I slept, I opened the letter one more time and read the line I had missed at the bottom of the second page, a line so small it had nearly hidden behind the fold. If you ever wonder whether this mattered, count the chairs you set out and find one empty at the end of the night. That one is for the person who almost didn't come. Leave it out anyway. So I do. I leave one chair waiting even when the weather suggests no one will ask it to work. I leave one cup upside down so it doesn't collect dust but can be turned quickly if thirst surprises us. I leave a pen near the kettle and a card that says this room does not argue. I leave a corridor of lights and the courage to move from one to the next without insisting on seeing the whole hallway. When people ask how the story ends, I tell them it doesn't. It settles. It learns its shape. It stops trying to be a parade and becomes, finally, a neighborhood. A phone buzzed in a pocket once and said, "I'm still here." The echo it left behind isn't a ringtone anymore. It is the sound of chairs sliding into a circle, and a kettle remembering its song, and a bench holding the weight it was made to keep. It is a woman in a soft brim hat turning into a person without armor. It is a widow learning that after is a place you can furnish with patience. And when I forget, because I do, I press record in the nursery and let the red light wink me back to myself. I say the sentence in a room that has learned to keep me and people like me, and people not like me at all, I say, "I'm still here." Then I set out the cups and the socks and the names and leave one chair empty for whoever needs it next.